Most Americans, unfortunately, don't understand freedom of speech.
We have the intervention just this week of potentially actions by the Federal Communications Commission, which really troubles me.
Political tribalism is being engineered and normalized via mass communications, and people simply just need to turn it off. And they need to see the human in their neighbor, and they need to turn the nonsense off.
It's Friday, and that means it's another edition of Real Polling in Real Time with Zogby. I'm John Zogby, and as always, I'm right here with Jeremy, my son, managing partner. How are you doing this week?
I'm doing okay. And you?
Yeah, I'm doing okay. I mean, personally, we're doing okay. To folks out there, if you're looking for a message of hope, hopefully that'll be next week. This is not a good week. And I, for one, am very worried about the state of freedom of speech in this country. And I'm going to wing it here because I have so many things on my mind. I didn't write any of them down. But let me begin by saying I blame both sides equally for this. It is now the Republicans' turn. It is now a backlash following the killing of Charlie Kirk. But believe me, the overzealous attempt at controlling our language and controlling our culture that emanated from the left was something very disturbing, especially to those of us who have a long history on the left. And so here we are reaping a serious backlash. A number of things that bother me. The first is government intervention in freedom of speech, which is not only a violation of our constitutional rights, but is dangerous and threatening. We have done it before. We've done it during wartime. However, the Alien and Sedition Acts that actually imprisoned people for speaking out against war, we've had those, since the late 1790s and right through. And nobody looks to those periods with nostalgia. Those were awful, ugly periods. We're not in wartime right now. And we have the intervention just this week of potentially actions by the Federal Communications Commission, which really troubles me, and a direct line, it appears, that can be drawn between the statements, threats of the FCC chairman and the cancellation of the Jimmy Kimmel show. Second thing that troubles me is what it is doing to us, what it's doing to our culture, that there are people who are fired for disagreeing with Charlie Kirk, people who have been fired for saying nasty things about Charlie Kirk, inappropriate, poorly timed, for later on down the road. There are genuine disagreements. It troubles me that Jimmy Kimmel has become the face of this. Personally, I never thought he was very funny, but also his job is to be a late night comic. And he crossed the line. If you're looking for a nightly rant, then go to cable television, or stay within your family and neighborhood and argue with folks. But Jimmy Kimmel's job was to be funny. And what he said was, let's just put a friendly spin on it, inappropriate. But that's a whole separate issue. Nexstar was well within its rights to not distribute a show. ABC well within their rights to say, hey, your ratings aren't good and you don't belong on the air. At least let's review this. The bottom line is Jimmy Kimmel has a right to freedom of speech. He is not entitled to a nighttime show. There's a difference there. I can speak my mind and I can do it privately. I can go out and do it publicly. But if I'm claiming to represent my employer, then my employer has well within its rights to say, this is not helping us. This is hurting our clientele, hurting our base of support, our audience, or whatever. I know there are folks that may disagree with that, but I don't think that that Jimmy Kimmel is heroic in any of this. And I warn folks in Hollywood that look for a hero elsewhere. Look for a hero among those on campus who have continued to teach or tried to teach and teach both sides, or have tried to teach a version of American history that folks on the left and the right disagree with, but there's supposed to be academic freedom on campus. People consider those who are heroic, who have said a word that is no longer considered in vogue by a tiny group on the left, and have had to pay, dearly for that by losing their jobs. But one final comment is that the president's behavior in all of this has been shameful. Instead of trying to heal a wound, instead of trying to bond people together, he has immediately gone to the jugular and revving up the troops and promising more lawsuits, promising more firings. And this is not to say in any way, shape, or form that the left isn't responsible for this atmosphere as well, but it's President Trump's term at this moment, and his behavior has been disgraceful.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. I have to go back to your first point on freedom of speech. That plays a major role into the larger conversation about what we're having. What I fear and what I observe is that most Americans, unfortunately, don't understand freedom of speech anymore. I can actually remember a time where I think it was pretty well ingrained in our culture. Today, it's become ideological. Mm-hmm. Democrats in this moment who are fearful of what happened to Jimmy Kimmel and what is going to come from that. And you can already see the communications on the news, David Letterman saying, where this is going, implying we're headed towards full-blown authoritarianism. But the problem is those same voices didn't really see a problem when in previous administrations, particularly the Obama and Biden administration, the White House and social media networks were directly connected to each other. And evidence shows that the White House was aware of Facebook and Facebook's algorithms to silence those voices in opposition to the White House. And now the same phenomenon is happening here today, where Republicans who leading up to 2024 were championing freedom of speech now have just let that go. And so we don't really understand what freedom of speech is. But, when I was a kid, I remember it was so well ingrained in our culture that there were phrases that were commonly stated. For example, when I was in college and I would debate people older than me who were conservative, and we'd debate abortion or gun control, you would hear people say, it's a free country. I don't agree with what you're saying, but you know what? That's the beauty of America. It's a free country. And then when it got really heated, I remember hearing individuals say, and this was common in our language, people would say, I don't agree with you, but I will fight for your right to believe in that. And so there was a common culture. That is gone. You don't even hear people say that anymore. It's just people have their ideological version of freedom of speech. If it's racist, if you're a liberal and it's racist, cancel it. If you're a conservative and it's hateful towards conservative people, cancel it. It's dangerous. And here's the point. I saw the beginning of this. You saw the beginning of this. And this goes back 25 years. Look, I've read a lot of American history. I don't ever remember a time in American history where the notion of battleground states and battleground counties, we have been primed, our culture has been primed politically to think in terms of this as a battlefield. Just look at the language, battleground states, battleground counties. That's the phenomenon of a hyperpolarized political society. And now we are in the moment where a lot of people, and particularly us, have been asking the question about, some kind of civil war, right? And look, we don't mean Gettysburg, digging trenches, firing guns at each other on the battlefield with 10,000 deaths in one day. But what we are talking about is civil unrest. And this, as we talked about last week, a tipping point, a point of no return where political assassinations and violence become commonplace in this culture. And the reality is this: if you go on the news, whatever it is, CNN, Fox News, Drudge Report, all of the above, the Civil War is already taking place. Just look at the language, look at the vilification, and this has been going on. I'll go back to Biden and his speech in Philadelphia with a crimson red background, a blood red background, and I will draw a line to today with the announcement from Kash Patel saying, we're gonna refer to them as I'm assuming this is accurate, but the notion that transgender people are characterized as a broader type of a violent cohort. But remember, the same thing was going on under Biden, the frequent term of MAGA extremists, Republican extremists. And so this is where we're at. And the messaging is full blown. And so where does it go from here? This is my warning. It's not my prediction, but it's my warning. Look up the communications leading up to the Rwandan genocide and the role that the radio communications played in that. In fact, I'm going to give you a summary from Google's Gemini. These were the moments that led to the Rwandan genocide. The communications over the radio first started to dehumanize the Tutsi population. That was the population that had the genocide waged against them. Well, we have both sides dehumanizing each other. The demonization of political opposition, well, we've had that for quite a while. And the using euphemisms to normalize violence. Unfortunately, we are hearing suggestive language that's telling people essentially to mobilize and get mad. And the difference, obviously, in the case of Rwanda is that it was culturally a tribal society. But you can see politically that political tribalism is being engineered and normalized via mass communications, and people simply just need to turn it off. And they need to see the human in their neighbor and the human in the opposition, and they need to turn the nonsense off, unless it's going to tell them otherwise.
You bring up a fascinating point, especially pointing to the genocide in Rwanda. And it just underscores for me back to this country how much both political parties have long ago outlived their usefulness. That not only within Washington, D.C., and all of the breakdown of relationships, the non-relationships, the antipathy that members of each party have for the other, but how campaigns are waged. Campaigns have always been tough. And I've been involved. My first campaign as a volunteer was in 1968. And negative advertising was becoming, a part of it. But, as we get into the 90s and now into this century, the campaigns I see, in a congressional district, it is not uncommon to have a Democrat and a Republican candidate who know each other. I mean, you're talking about a relatively small area. Anyway, you're talking about prominent people who possibly have done business with each other, whose families may be interlocked with each other in some way, may have even been friends of each other. But as soon as they declare their candidacy and have an R or a D, then the DCCC, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, swoops in, sends in a bunch of 20-somethings who are trained in warfare, period, who hire opposition research. I have no problem with opposition research on your voting record, on policies with which I disagree. What I do have problems with is the hammering of half-truths, all for one purpose: win, and don't just beat the other candidate, grind that bug into the carpet. Yeah. And that's how campaigns are waged. How are we supposed to govern then once the campaign is over? I've seen actual Democrats and Republicans start out campaigns as friends, colleagues, mutually respectful, and end up long-term hating each other. And, this all reinforces this system that we're in. But now we're at a point where we're actually trying to snuff out the opposition, snuff out their freedom of speech, and for that matter, snuff out even our friends when they don't use, what our polls have shown, 3% favor the term Latinx. And yet how many times have you been corrected for saying Latino or Latina? No, it's Latinx. Who talks like that? Persons who give birth. Yeah. How many times have you been corrected for saying, oh, the pregnant woman, our pregnant neighbor?
Yeah, and I just, because what you say it's powerful, because you're talking about the leadership, you're talking about candidates and the infrastructure of campaigns, and that's all coming from the top, right? And then I'm saying, well, what can citizens do? They don't have to get involved in the hyperpolarization. They don't have to get involved in the political tribalism. But then it just dawned on me with those examples that you provided. What discussion ultimately doesn't lead to politics? Like, you can't even talk about parenting anymore without it ultimately ending up in a political debate, right? You can't even talk about farming. You can't even talk about food. Everything leads to politics. And of course, as we've demonstrated pretty clearly, the politics here is toxic and nasty. And it's brewing. It's actually bubbling over.
So we know that we need to be sensitive. We need to be sensitive to other people, other peoples. There are some totally inappropriate words and terms that cannot and should not be used, and we need to teach our kids that. However, we live in a milieu right now where if I'm critical of Israel, my words are conflated with anti-Semitism. Couldn't be farther from the truth. And when I've challenged people who've challenged me, they've said, no, but that's anti-Israel. I said, no, it's not. My criticism is critical of Israel. It's neither anti-Semitic, come on, or anti-Israel, come on. I can't condemn a policy of a nation. So one of the things that we need to understand is that this is a very slippery slope that we're in right now. And there is a world of difference between saying words and having them be conflated with something that was never anyone's intention whatsoever. So it filters down government intervention, the Department of Justice, the Federal Communications Commission, sicking them now on folks, sicking the federal government on colleges and universities where freedom of speech is supposed to be sacrosanct. Although I certainly do recall that it was the left shouting down conservative speakers not that long ago, possibly yesterday. But we're at a tipping, I don't want to use the word tipping point. We're at a very dangerous point right now. And the person who can put an end to this is the person who will not put an end to it. And that has to be the President of the United States.
The last thing I'll say, taking in everything that you're saying, is that the worst depictions of both sides have become normalized. Mm-hmm. And I think our job as pollsters is to figure out and show what percentage of the population do not fit into those profiles of the rabid leftist and the rabid conservative. And I have a strong feeling that a plurality, and maybe even a majority, of Americans don't. And if there were a grand realization of that, maybe things could tone down.
I think one thing we have to remember, because I've heard people say this nation is sick. It isn't. Its people are fine. And you find that in every walk of life. You know, we just went to a little event, your kid's school. And on the way, there was a sign on a post. And I always point to this because I see these a lot. An informal fundraiser in a village for a little child who has leukemia and whose parents don't have enough money to pay their health bills. And I think that's the goodness of a lot of people, and there's a lot of them. Now, if I go to that, I know enough to not mention Hillary Clinton's name or Donald Trump's name, because that's what divides us. But if we can focus on what unites us, and I know, look, this sounds so Pollyannish, but the truth is there's a lot of goodness out there, and we need to be searching for it. And I think our responsibility as pollsters, as you say, is find those common areas. That's it.
Yeah.
Have a good week. Maybe some optimism next week, hopefully.
Hopefully. Have a good weekend.
You too.